Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Edit Undo podcast. And we finally get the full circle picture. In our first conversation in the series, we chatted with Sabiha, the CEO and founder of Jack Creative Studio. And in that conversation, we looked at, how a freelancer, how a person kind of just looking to make money in between their student life and make ends meet, eventually turns that into a functioning business. And then how that actually changes on an ongoing basis. We had a great conversation with her about how she's thinking about her own organization and its evolution over, these next couple of years. And then we dived a little bit more into how Jack as an organization looks at its clients' problems and the challenges that are initially presented to them. And that was the conversation with Paul and Claire. And today we have the two that make the magic happen. Dylan, Claudia, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you. Super excited to get onto this podcast and just go for it.
Amazing. And there's a lot, especially because we're sort of like all designers in this conversation now, and the textbook style. It will be great to get into some of the details of the case studies, which we only started to touch on in our last conversation. But before we do that, I'd like to, do the usual clock rollback and get a little bit of the backstory. I think I remember the story that I think Sabia shared a little bit of it when she first met you guys and kind of like going from being a solo person to starting to build a team. But it would be great to hear a little bit from you guys' perspective. What did it look like right before you joined Jack? Like, where were you in your lives? And then maybe just walk us through like how your professional journey has evolved in this time that you've been at Jack Studio.
Dylan,
I don't know.
Go for it.
Dylan, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I think so. Just before I started at Jack, I just finished my interactive development degree at Open Window. And throughout the year, I would say in the mid-year break, I saw Jack Studios on one of the lists that Open Window provided us to a place to go do intern and get hours for the degree. And when I opened the site, I was like, this is the place I need to be. Think looking at the design as a designer. Well, I was a developer actually by degree. And then I sort of, as I went through studies, I realized I like design way, way more. And that's where my talent lied as well. And sort of how it has evolved to now. Quite a big change, I would say. As I was very much purely in a development mindset with the extra touch of design when I had time to do it on the projects. And then sort of that development mind carried through to my designs. So when we get a system design project, I would be able to sort of understand what dev goes into that and design according to those guidelines. And then in terms of how I found my style in design and where I am now currently is, I would just say I went fully design with a side of Webflow development. So still having that dev incorporated somehow, but more design focused. And my skills how my skills have developed from when I started at Jack until now is I'm a way more detailed designer. So that's where when Sabia and Paul of them spoke about going deeper, it's just taking more time crafting experiences, crafting UI design elements, making sure there's moments of delight throughout the app, things like that. So that's where that's the fun part for me, is crafting those very specific things. And this is where I'm now.
Amazing. That's very cool. And I think it'll be interesting to talk a little bit more about that. Like, straddling that line between design and development. I think that's one of the, like, I typically find there are almost two perspectives about that. There are either the people who will do absolutely everything they can to avoid code, and then there are those people who kind of find themselves doing code regardless of what their job title is.
Yeah.
And so I think it'll be interesting to talk a little bit more about that with you. But before we do that, Claudia, maybe you can give us a little bit of a backstory on your side. What it was like, where you were right before you joined, what you were doing, where your head was at, and maybe you could also add a little bit about, how you first met Dylan. I'm not sure if it was in Jack that you guys first met. What is it before Jack? What was that like?
So Dylan and I studied in the same degree, same university. We were in the same class. So I met Dylan in my first year of studies, actually. It was sort of a case of we didn't know each other, but we were in the same class. So we knew each other, but also didn't. But so basically my story or my process leading up to Jack Studios is very similar to Dylan's. I also studied development, thinking that was my path to go through. And basically, I slowly realized this is maybe not what I want to do. And I've realized that a bit more clearly when I started getting involved with Jack Studios, I'd say. I got involved with Jack Studios more towards the end of my final year. I also did it for internship hours. So yeah, that was basically at the end of my final year. And then the following year, I just carried on working for Jack Studios essentially. And I also went through the process of exploring within design what I would enjoy, because I didn't really go as in depth with design during my studies. I was way more focused on code and proper methodologies for code and everything like that. So I do naturally have a more systematic brain, but I think visually at the same time. So design, I still was drawn way more to that. Code was not as appealing to me. So yeah, I started my journey with Jack then, at the beginning of last year. It started out was basically exactly the same work Dylan would do. Him and I would work on the same projects, would move between projects. I did pretty much most of the things that he did, branding. I went through the website development as well, just basic design things that you would get in a design studio. And then this year, it sort of started to specialize a bit more. I was able to sort of go into a certain section a bit more. And this is actually with the help of you, Alfie, and going through the sessions with you, sort of seeing where I strive a bit more, where's my focus area a bit more located. And this year, we've actually been able to sort of create departments within our team where we sort of split the design in a branding marketing side and a system side, where I was obviously in the system side because that's where I thrive in. I thrive in creating systems for products, designing them out, like system flows, and eventually designing that out as well. But with Dylan and I differ is he will go in depth with design and UI details, but I go in depth with systems and making sure all the mini micro flows are touched on within a system. So that's where we complement each other as well, because I will go through the system very elaborately, and then Dylan will just knock it out of the park with the UI afterwards. So that's where I'm at now. Now I sort of consider myself like a system designer, more specifically. I dabble sometimes in marketing here and there. I've done it a couple of times, but I consider myself a system designer now.
And so I think this is just such a poetic moment, because I think in some ways the partnership that you guys have was very similar to Steph, to what you and I had when we were still working at ABSA. Now, I think that the types of roles were not, or the distinction wasn't along that same line. But I think there's something very interesting about this idea of design partnerships. And it's something that I've been waiting specifically to talk to the two of you about, because I think the way the two of you work is not the same as the way Paul and Claire work. and even in the conversations that we were having, I was already starting to see inklings of it, and I think it really came out in when we had that exercise of the what was it, the your ideal, was it the ideal collaborator or something like that?
Yeah.
I can't remember. Anyway, so the concept was focused around identifying your strengths and weaknesses, but then looking for an alternate way to look at your weaknesses, and instead of looking at them as weaknesses, looking at them as things to look for in your partner.
Yeah.
So when I think about the way I work as a designer, I know that there are parts of the design process which I'm really good at, and then there are parts of the design process which I'm embarrassingly bad at.
Yeah,
and so when I think about the types of people that I want to work with, I use those as almost as a measuring stick. It's like, okay, how are you in these spaces? Because I see the value in it. I just know that I'm not going to be the person to bring that value to the table. And so I think it's great because I had the initial sense of that idea when working with you, Steph, at ABSA, because I think we built quite a good cadence in terms of dividing who is good at which part. And then I think working with you guys was the first time I'd seen it in other people. And so can you guys maybe talk a little bit about, like, when you think about what each one of you brings to the table? Claudia, maybe you could start this time around. Like, what is it about how the two of you collaborate together? Or what is it in Dylan's skill set that you maybe see yourself not as good at, which you specifically appreciate, and vice versa?
Well, I think for me, it's pretty easy. Like, Dylan's got a extremely incredible talent when it comes to visual design and visual layout and the detail therein as well. He's got a very it's like a natural understanding of it almost. And I feel like in my sort of the way I think, it's not necessarily like that. I think of the bigger picture when I work. I'm more overall type of person, whereas Dylan will immediately think of the detailed part of what the system is instead of thinking of the bigger picture, which is why I go more into system side. So that's sort of like the side that I really find value in with Dylan, is being able to get into the detail and executing visually in a like amazing way. Something that I am not proficient in. Definitely that,
Yeah.
I'll say.
No, that's amazing, and I think in some ways I resonate with parts of that. And Dylan, on your side, like, what would you say about the role that Claudia kind of brings in your partnership, that you either find that you need, or even it might even be that you find that it's not the type of work that you like?
Yeah, I would say definitely system design, like mapping out a system without having a UI or aesthetic UI paint layer over the system. For me, I struggle to then visualize because I want to jump in, like Claudia would look at the card and information. I would look at the border radius and what the border color is going to be.
More tangible. Yeah.
Yeah. So definitely for me, if I would have mapped out a system, it would have taken me 5 times as long as Claudia would do it, because she really has that big picture thinking brain, and I've tried to put that cap on, but it didn't it didn't go as well. But yeah, because then I sort of get lost in the details, and that's where I found a lot of value in Claudia's work. And her specialties is to be able to look at the big thing and sort of map it out, and then we can collaborate, and then I can go into the finer details. And yeah, so definitely in that sense, yeah, that's something I would want to learn, or would want to have the skill, but not necessarily would want to do the work, that type of work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know what I find interesting of this conversation of like design partnerships, and you guys basically validated my own opinion that I have for myself around when design partnerships work really well and when they feel more forced. And kind of what Alfie also said about, when him and I started working together, it felt natural. You kind of naturally pick up on the other person's strengths and weaknesses, almost like you fit, almost like a puzzle. And the same, it kind of sounds like the same happened to you guys. But the element there that makes it feel natural, which I can pick up from what you guys are saying, is you have a set or a level of awareness of what the other person is good at, either because you have tried it yourself and through that you have discovered that you're not good in it, but through that you have some level of understanding of what it is you don't get and you're not good at. And that also leverages you a sense of awareness and respect then when you meet the counterpart for that skill. Because I find that that's always lacking, or not always, rather, I'm making an assumption, but the typical cliche, it's often lacking when you think about, for instance, the partnership of development and design, right? The reason why development design can often not be as well when it comes to partnerships, because neither of them not always have the awareness of what the other one has done, try to understand and do it themselves, to have that level-headed understanding, and then also vice versa, respect for what the other person is doing. And that's kind of what I'm seeing you guys saying as well, and why it felt so natural. Because Dylan, you said you've tried the big picture thinking and you've tried to get into the systems methodology, and Claudia, you said you've tried the visual design, so you've tried to go deeper in that aspect, and because of that it felt more natural when you found someone that does it to kind of let that process and that partnership flow a little bit easier.
Yes.
And Steph, you mentioned something so amazing there, and I think it almost organically aligns with this idea of going deeper, is that to really be able to go deeper, there's a level of trust and vulnerability that's necessary to assume that your partner is going deeper in their own space. Because the only thing that will let you go deeper is if you know that there is somebody who is covering your other bases. Because what you give up when you're going deeper is the stability that comes from a broad base. Yes. A broad base brings you stability at the cost of specialization. Specialization gives you intense capability in a single domain, which means you need to have that trusting relationship and you need to have that understanding that your counterpart is going deeper in their own skill set. And I think, Steph, you've also laid up perfectly the opportunity to dive into this question about the distinction between design and development, because especially with Figma's last update, with things like Framer, that distinction is becoming very, very blurry. Like, what are your initial thoughts about that before we even go any further? What are you guys' thoughts on the design tool landscape? Dylan, you look like you have an opinion to
share. For me, I sort of did get a fright when I saw these tools coming out, because then I would think, my job can sort of become redundant because someone can just type on the Figma AI, make me this website with this, and then it just generates the website. But then I sort of, when me and Claire were speaking about this exact topic as well, we sort of recognize that it's going to become more of us using that as tools to create better things. So let's say I want to design a very specific card. Then I can type in design me a card, and then I can use that card and then modify it to make it even better. So sort of becoming a builder instead of a designer. So you use different things to build a design, if that makes sense. But I think it's fun because Jack Studios, like a week ago, subscribed to Midjourney, and that's been super fun to try that out.
I love Midjourney.
No, I honestly, when it first came out, I did have a negative connotation to it, but now having worked with some of the tools, actually, I really enjoy it a lot.
Okay, nice. Claudia, maybe you could give me somewhat of a different answer, because I think one of the things I'm a little bit interested in, and I don't know how much time you guys have had to look at this, is specifically how design tools are stepping further into the domain of code, and how code tools are stepping closer into the domain of design. Because when I think about something like Framer, it's like you don't, like, dev is just not there. It's just kind of like you design it and then you're finished. And that has never been the case before. There have been a lot of attempts at achieving that, but Framer is the first time I've seen that done in a way that's sustainable. I don't know if it, or even like some of your thoughts on kind of like where Figma is going and what you're thinking about that.
So, in my personal experience, I haven't actually had as much direct engagement with like these sort of tools. But I have seen discourse around it and seeing what people are saying. It's very, from what I have seen, it's very half-half. I find myself somewhere in the middle as well, where, as Dylan said, this is not necessarily something that's going to take your job away. It could only make it better. That's definitely something that I can see happening. On the other side, I don't know how to explain it, but it does sort of make our work a bit more niche almost, because now it's like with Canva, I guess, like graphic designers are struggling because Canva exists, because you can just take 5 minutes to select a template and there you go. So I think this is like sort of happening in our space as well now, a bit more with these sort of tools. And I see the worry in that as well. I recognize it. But I feel like it shouldn't necessarily just be a bad thing, because you also have to grow with the technology that's getting used. You have to move with it, not bring it back, because otherwise there's no like you're not evolving. You're just staying the same the whole time, which is not ideal. So I recognize the fears behind it, but I agree with Dylan, and I agree with the making use of it to better your own work or to better your own circumstance.
Okay. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and I think it's a question I think that generally in the industry we're going to be asking we're going to need to be asking ourselves more and more, because one thing I know for sure is that it's not going to slow down.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's like the cat's out of the bag and it's happening. It's more like, now as an industry, how do we react to that? Do we embrace it, or do we get in some sense left behind? But I think that's a philosophical conversation for another day.
It's a whole thing.
Very true. What I think though would be interesting to talk a little bit about is if we kind of pick up the conversation where Paul and Claire left it off. We've kind of been walking. We've been having individual these conversations in the first 2 episodes directly, but there's also been a larger conversation at work, and it's this conversation of the life cycle that a customer goes as they're engaging with Jack. And the first is typically this engagement that's more either in a social setting, at an event, in a profession, like a kind of like work professional thing, where Sabia meets someone and they've got this idea, and she walks them through this process of turning their thoughts into something that can actually begin to be engaged with as your organization. And then Paul and Claire gave us this idea, and they really went into depth into this idea of going deeper, both in terms of the type of work that you're doing, but also in terms of how you're engaging and how you're choosing the customers that you will work with. Now, what I was thinking might be good to dive into a little bit with you guys today is how, when you've got the problem clearly identified, how you think of and approach solving them. And I was hoping that we could, as we kind of progress in this conversation, we can go through a couple of example case studies from the Jack Studio website. But maybe a place to start with is you know, I know there's been a couple of changes in the way you guys work recently, and Paul and Claire kind of gave us a bit of an overview. But what I'd like to get into detail with you guys is how are you guys thinking about briefs differently? Because I think briefs are one of the things that are common across all design disciplines, right? This idea of turning a person's problem into a quote unquote job request. Can you share a little bit, you know, has the way you guys think about briefs changed from before you kind of flattened out this structure and created these two deep narrow niches? And if so, what have those changes looked like? And maybe Dylan, you could start us off with your initial thoughts.
So yeah, since we've done the split from branding, marketing, and system and product, me and Claire have been working together in the branding and marketing space. And I would say, in terms of the briefs and the way I see it, it did change from previously. As I know, Claire is a brand and marketing specialist. And let's say if I was working with Paul, whose domain is more product and system side, and before we did the split, let's say I would receive a brief for a brand piece from Paul, then I would have looked at it differently, as opposed to Claire giving me a brief. And then with the flattening out system coming in more, and us going deeper and specializing, specifically me, it's actually a brand new thing that it's learning branding. And I've sort of learned it over the past year and a half. And looking at the briefs, then with the leveling out, the briefs are way shorter, because me and Claire are in the same mind space, so she doesn't have to type use this font for this logo. It sort of levels out. So when I look at the brief, I just have a quick squiz instead of looking in depth and doing exactly what the brief says. So having that seesaw balance out gives me more responsibility to tweak and change things. So the brief is, for me, is just a general guideline instead of looking at it as a tech spec. This is exactly what you need to do. And also with that, me and Claire have this thing, because we want to level out the seesaw. We both learn from each other, because Claire is still fairly new to Figma. So we sort of learn each other. I learn from branding. She learns from my UI design skills and things like that. So I definitely, that's how my approach changed to briefs. It's more of a general guideline.
Sounds like there's a lot of trust then.
Yes, exactly. And that's where, Jack Studios plays a big role in that, and creating that space to be so personal with one another. So that's what happened with me and Claire. We went through this whole phase of, we had miscommunication, and then we sort of both opened up about what the feelings are and how we want to work together. And that was like 2 weeks ago. And since then, it's been a dream working together. So yeah.
Nothing like a good old therapy session.
Exactly.
Yeah, a good old heart-to-heart has fixed many issues. And I think it'll be interesting to talk a little bit more about that. Oh, there goes my earphone. It'll be good to talk a little bit more about that as we go. But and specifically this dynamic between you and Claire, because I think there's something really valuable there, and it's a pattern I've seen in many small businesses, where there is a person that is really experienced in one domain and not as experienced in the other. And I've seen a lot of places where it's difficult for them to learn from other people if they don't have that level of trust. Because to be so experienced and then at the same time, in some way, humble yourself to learn from this person who's like a year out of varsity, and you're like, however many years like out of the game. So I think it'll be great for us to dive into that. But I'd like to hear a little bit more, Claudia, on your side. How has the way you receive or engage with briefs changed as this sort of structural changes happened?
So in the beginning, I would say it's like coming fresh out of university. a brief always just looked like a list of requirements to me. Like, you need to have this in the project. This is what needs to happen. It just needs to happen. And me with a system mind, I would just think, okay, yeah, it's like I always had a very binary way of thinking, like yes, no, not what's the meaning or why. So I would actually say, because I worked a bit in brand and marketing beforehand, it actually gave me more of an understanding about the why, like why certain things are being done, like user journeys and all of that. That actually like made my process of reading system briefs way better. Like understanding the why of why I'm putting these things together and why this is happening and everything like that. Because I would say typically I wouldn't have necessarily gone that in depth if I was just solely in system. I think that bit of marketing thinking or branding thinking rather really improved my way of system design. So I'd say like in the beginning, it was just a list of things, and it slowly gradually became like, okay, why are we doing this? Why is this system needing these things? And it's sort of now I've sort of gotten to the point where it's not actually a list of items anymore like it used to be. The way that I work, because I work with Paul in the system product side, the way that we work is we brainstorm together, like one-on-one, and we talk through what needs to be done, say, for example, in a day. We say, this is the part of the system that we need to do. Okay, let's discuss it. So then we'll go through the flows just by talking to each other and like explain to each other, like bounce off like, okay, this is going to go this way, but maybe this should actually be that way. And we'll basically... together we'll conceptualize our own brief instead of writing it down. We'll just talk through it. And my method of internalizing information is just by listening. I'm not the type of person that'll take notes while someone is talking. I just internalize all of it and then I apply it afterwards. So that's actually my preferred way of working. And we do that now.
Yeah.
So, and it's working pretty well.
Might sound like someone you know, Steph. I'm exactly the same. Like if I have a new problem to solve, I have to talk about it before I write anything. If I write anything down, I'm just going to be wasting time. I just need somebody to sit on the other side of the camera and just talk to me for like a good couple, like maybe an hour and a half. And then after that, I can do all of the great things. But without that conversation, I feel like I'm just grasping at straws.
Yeah, and like for me right now at this stage, I am definitely still learning about the depths of system design because it's the first time I'm specializing in it. So while we have these conversations, Paul will be teaching me about various things in system, like why certain things are done at the same time. So it's like two things are actually happening at once, but for me, it's the best way to learn because it's practical learning, which is very similar to how we actually were in university. Open Window is it had very practical courses. And I found that to be very effective. And right now I'm basically doing that with Paul as well as I go through my system phase. So that's very fun. Actually, I'm really enjoying it right now.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, there's one more thing I want to talk a little bit about before we actually get into a couple of the case studies. So there were two that we started looking at last time, which we'll go into, and one was about Luulo, and that was a branding project, and the other was Weeva, and that was the sustainability platform. But before we go into that, I want to talk a little bit about this idea of specialization, because I think it's a thing that doesn't have enough guidelines. And it's a thing that I think I've had a one-on-one conversation and an in-depth conversation with each of you about this concept of specialization. And so what I'd specifically like to do is talk a little bit about how you were thinking about your career development before we had that conversation, and how you're thinking about your career development progression after we had the conversations. Does that make sense? Does the question make sense before we move forward?
Yes.
Yeah.
Cool. And I'm gonna
Maybe for the audience and myself, what conversation you're referring to? Maybe you can just give a.
Oh, yes. I have a tendency to assume people know these things. So, okay, a little bit of context around the conversations that we were having. One of the projects that I'd been working on for a while was this idea of a mentorship program that was focused specifically on learning about your discipline or your career as you're practicing, and turning that into a system that's repeatable. And so that's kind of like, I initially approached Sabia with this concept when they were running their first design bootcamp, and I was simply a mentor in the bootcamp, and it it eventually evolved into like a official engagement between myself and Jack, where I was doing a kind of running this mentorship program with them live on the side while I was kind of also working at my job. And what was interesting is it took the format of a 1 hour conversation once a week. And we would talk about your career development, we'd talk about your personal experience, we would talk about your background. But we wouldn't actually go into the details of any client work, and we wouldn't go into the details of what's going on a day-to-day basis. It was a lot more focused around how you see yourself in the context of the team, and how you see yourself in the future. And that was kind of like the very brief summary of kind of what we were doing. And what I'd like us to talk a little bit about is how you guys were thinking about your career progression and how it changed after our conversation. And Claudia, I don't know if maybe you wanna kick us off this time.
So beforehand, before we had that whole mentorship, I would say I didn't have any clear idea of what I wanted to do. I had an idea that I enjoyed system more than design or branding. But I didn't really know that you could specialize in certain, like in system, or you could be like a special type of designer in that sense. I thought it was always just a case of you're just a product designer, or you're just a UX, UI, whatever it may be, designer. So I was pretty lost in that sense, I would say, like all of those sort of things, I wasn't sure. And then during and after the mentorship, it sort of became clearer how I could implement what I prefer, how I could sort of fall more into system design, and instead of the other side, branding and marketing. And I mean, it did take a while to eventually get to that specialized area, but I sort of needed time as well to be able to develop my own skills a bit more in that side, because my skills were very half at the time. It was very split between the two departments, because I didn't know which one to like go forward in or what to do. But then afterwards, I was like, okay, I'm going to focus more on system now, because it's clear this is what I want to do. So I took the time to sort of, I don't know, just become more proficient in system design, sort of really lean into that side of the work, and then eventually embark on just becoming like a specialized system designer. Because now, like at that point I knew I could. So it was sort of just, I think the most value I got out of it was actually finding out about this and knowing I could do it afterwards, because it was I was completely in the dark about it. And in university as well, I was very set on like dev, not design wasn't necessarily a huge focus. I enjoyed it, but I never focused on it. But it was a huge realization after those mentorship sessions.
Appreciate it. Dylan, and on your side, how have you? What were your thoughts beforehand? What are some of the things maybe that might have changed through that process, and where is your mind at now on that question?
I think beforehand I was in a very similar situation as Claudia, and I wasn't sure exactly. I knew I liked branding, I knew I liked doing marketing, website design, but I also liked UI design, and not so much UX. UX was a bit more of a medium-ish vibe for me. And then after the mentorship program, I sort of realized you opened up all the doors to the different roles that exist, like specialist roles that exist. And having been exposed with the mentorship program to seeing those different options or different roles, it made my mind way clearer, because we spoke about the roles and what each one could look like. And when you see them, you sort of, I went off initial vibe. So if I would see system design, I would, yeah. Oh. So
Yeah.
and definitely afterwards, the thing I'm still dabbling about is, so when we talked about all the roles in the mentorship program, I'm still in this headspace of wanting to dabble my fingers in a lot of things. It's sort of, I want to become a specialist, but I also want to do a lot of stuff. And that's still something that needs to be figured out. Because like,
Yeah, good luck.
if you
10
think,
years later, still there.
like you said, Alfie, if you think specialist, you think about one thing and going deeper in one thing. But what about a personality that is a jack of all trades that also wants to specialize? So
at least what I can say off the top of my head, and this is something that my older brother Alex told me about, because I mean, so he's the head of design at ABSA and probably has over 100 people reporting to him. So he's seen very many parts of design. And what he talks about is almost like this, or at least he talked about it at that point in time. But there's almost like a cycle that you go through. It's like you don't specialize through your entire career. You've got phases of specialization where you're going deeper in a specific area and you're really interested in it. And then sometimes you figure it out and you no longer want to do it anymore. And I mean, as crazy as it sounds, I'm feeling like that about design right now. There was a time where I wanted to do all of the design things all of the time, from like, UI design to graphic design. And now it's kind of like I want to design for myself and I don't want to design for anybody else. And what I'm looking at now is a completely different industry, and I'm interested in many different things in that industry. And so I think there's quite a conversation to be had at many different levels about what career progression can look like, and what is career progression versus what is your next job. And I think that to me was one of the things that started to become clear when I was having conversations with you guys, because we didn't actually talk about your work. I didn't know what clients you were working on. I didn't know what the actual work you were outputting was, but I knew about the details around how you see your own work. And to me, that was the thing that was really interesting, which I always found missing in the professional environment, is a place to have a conversation about the long-term prospects of your career. It's like thinking beyond just the company that I'm working with and answering questions that don't have an immediate bottom line impact. Because even though they don't have an immediate bottom line impact, they've got a massive impact on the long term. And I think that was in some ways the focus around what I wanted to do with you guys. And I think we at least made progress. I don't think it's a thing that will ever end, because our careers are going on as long as we are here on this earth. But what might be cool is if we bring that down into a little bit of practicality and have a little bit of a look at two of the projects that we kind of started off with last time. And it'll be interesting to hear a little bit of, from each one of you. And Dylan, it would be great. And you can let me know if this is a distinction that you want to use. But if you could walk us through some of the work on Luulo and how you are thinking about branding, because I think you worked on that, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes.
And then Claudia, on your side, it would be cool if we can chat a little bit more about Weeva. And what I'm hoping that we can specifically focus on is making clear this distinction about how we're thinking about brand and going deeper on that side, and how we're thinking about system and product and going deeper on that side. So I am going to just pull this up for us here. And then I'm going to ask, shall we start with Weeva maybe? So I think where we kind of left off in the previous the conversation with the previous two was really highlighting the need that the customer has, what each one of them were trying to achieve and how they engaged you. And what will be interesting for us to talk about this time around is I'd almost like you to talk to some of the things that we're seeing and highlight some of the thinking process that happened between, the brief and when it actually came to, what we're seeing on the screen here. And I think that's what will be really cool. But I think you can kind of take it however you want. If you think there's another approach that you'd like to, use to describe it, feel free to do so. And so I'll kind of let you take it from there.
Perfect. Okay, so Weeva. Weeva was one of our first projects actually that we worked on at Jack, which happened to be one of the biggest ones as well. It's still an ongoing project that we are busy with at the moment. So Weeva, like you said, is like a conservation platform, basically, which when we started this project, we knew nothing about, like the in-depth things of conservation and what it comes with. And so I think the very first step in understanding this project was understanding the source material, like trying to gauge what they were doing to begin with. The client, when they presented the idea, they had a sort of brief idea of what they wanted, but they didn't know how to implement it. We worked a lot with Jess. She was the one that spoke to us most oftentimes to sort of like give us the ideas that the specialists had. Julie and a few other people in the background, they were all just like a bunch of really clever specialist people in the world of conservation. Like they were so clever. It was so daunting in the beginning. But they knew what they wanted, which is what actually made the process a bit easier in the end. Yeah. Challenging in its own ways, but the brief was always clear and they would always let us know what was right and what was wrong. So yeah, I mean, the beginning stages was a lot of just conceptualizing and understanding for the actual system itself. And then after the system was created, we went into the marketing side after that only, because we first wanted to establish Weeva in the system, in the platform side of things. And
so,
yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you there, because I'd just like you to help lay out the landscape a little bit, because what I'm hoping you can share a little bit about is what that initial conversation. So when you were talking about how you approach system design, you were saying that what you like to do is start off with having a conversation and you talk with Paul about what needs to happen, and that's kind of like your typical process. And can you walk a little bit through what that looks like? And I'll give you a little bit of context around why I'd like you to focus there is I'm trying to illustrate specifically for the designer who is unfamiliar with how you guys work, what that process actually looks like, because we always get to see these amazing UI designs and we always get to see these like super polished product sort of promos, but it's very rare that you actually get to hear about what it looks like before all of these beautiful things actually come to be. And so can you maybe share a little bit about what was it like in those initial conversations when you had to talk to these daunting people who know about all kinds of things that obviously we as designers have got nothing, like no kind of foundational knowledge about. So can you share a little bit about that?
Yes, that was the biggest part of this project. Was the very beginning. So lots of the conceptualizing discussions and all of that I usually have with Paul was actually also had with the clients, because Paul also first had to understand what was going on to be able to let me understand what to do. So there were so many of those sessions with them, but they were always willing to share, which also helped a lot. They were always willing to explain things for us and just conceptualize as well. So basically, once Paul had a great idea of what needed to be done, then he would pass that on to us. And then we'd have the same sessions where we brainstorm and conceptualize like one-on-one, or like it was with Dylan as well, both of us with Paul. And we would just have these long discussions, just talking about one piece of the system, like just like the dashboard, for example, we just have this long, elongated, almost 2-hour discussion about what certain sections mean, why they're there, how they're supposed to be displayed. Because at the time for us, it was like way out, like what they were saying. Like we couldn't even visualize what they were trying to explain. It was so way out. And it took a while to be able to get to some, like a visual, something like looks tangible. And getting to that stage, we had lots of system flows, a very extensive system flow that we did, where we would basically create a system flow. But by system flow, I mean gray blocks and really ugly looking stuff. But it was just to sort of show these guys, like these specialists, what we think it could, like what information we think could be there and how it links up and everything like that. And we would have like bi-weekly sessions with them. And they would give us feedback live or afterwards, and we would implement that feedback until it was however they wanted it to be. And that was a very long process because this is a very large system. But so that system flow process was actually the very basis of Weeva. And like I say, it would be like, because if you see in the screenshot, for example, there's like a left-hand bar, and you see like a list of items. Basically, each of those items has like 6 different sections within it. Yeah.
Really putting the system in system flow.
Exactly. It was hectic. And not all of them were the same. Some things would be different from other things because of whatever category it was. So that's why the system flow side was so long and extensive, but completely necessary. So that happened for a long time. But then after that, we went into the next stage, essentially, which was the UI part, which actually I would say went slightly quicker than the system flow part because lots of the things were already approved and confirmed. This is when our struggle came in, was like trying to, what's the word? Like explain our designs or like try to convince these specialists, like this is how it should look visually, because they're not thinking about the visuals. They just think this information needs to show. Don't care how, it just needs to show. Sometimes we'd take a visual approach that they don't like, and then we'd have to try and just say, no, but this could work better. It was a lot of that because they knew exactly what they wanted. So like I said, that came with its own struggles at times. But overall, the design was way quicker. The design process didn't require as much conceptualizing and discussion like it did with the system flow, because that was already established mostly. There were some sections that had that, but it was nowhere near like with the system flow. So design went a bit smoother, I would say. And actually, the only sort of qualms that we had with design was with developers, because then developers would say, but we can't really develop this visual style that you have here or this aspect. Then we'd have to change things based on what the developers would say. That was actually most of our feedback at that stage was from developers in the UI phase. Yeah, and this
sounds like you set it up properly, especially if design felt smooth.
Yes, exactly. And I think this whole process in total took between 6 to 7 months from system to UI, which I guess for some is actually might not sound as long, but for us it felt like forever. So that's, and then like everything after the UI design of the platform just felt like nothing because we had gone through the trenches with the system flow and some of the UI design. So like the marketing websites, that was a whole different experience because we were working with a different team. We were working with a marketing team, not necessarily the specialists. So that was a whole different experience. They were way more picky, actually, funny enough. There was what they wanted in everything, but it wasn't as intense as the platform side. And I think Dylan actually he was heavily involved with the same as I was. We had so many experiences together with Weeva. It was one of the first projects that I learned so much from. Yes.
Just sorry to interrupt you, Dylan. Maybe you could just let me know. So, which part of the project would you say that you kind of focused on in Weeva? Like, did you play a significant role there, or were you working on other things at the time?
No, I think me and Claudia were the whole team was focused on this one big project.
Okay.
Me and Claudia were
Hectic.
both doing system flow and both doing UI design. We were sort of
Sure.
working together the whole time, actually. There was not a split
Okay.
happening because the system was so large and they wanted to get the system out at a certain period. So it did require me and Claudia working very closely together to get the system out and make sure it's what they want. But yeah, I was super involved in the UI design,
Okay.
system flow, marketing,
Cool.
website.
No.
Yeah.
No, that's good. I think I was just wondering whether it would be worthwhile going through the branding on that one, but maybe it would be good to chat a little bit about Luulo, because we are sort of reaching near the end of this conversation, and I'd just like to hear a little bit about some of your thoughts around branding, and specifically around how you thought about going from like the concept of what needs to be represented to the visual assets that we're looking at before we sort of start to wrap things up.
Yeah, so Luulo came to us for a complete brand redesign, and they wanted to redo and relaunch their website with the new look and feel of this brand. And it's all about WhatsApp chatbots for businesses to do like specific tasks and operations through just a WhatsApp chatbot, which was very interesting. But yeah, when I started, this was quite a new thing. I didn't know this is something that exists. So I first started to see if I could find something similar to what this is and how it functions and what the brands look like for this this niche or this product. And it was actually very difficult to find something that's similar to sort of like reference off, to make sure that if I do this branding for this project, how can I make it different and how can I make Luulo stand out from the others? So that was one aspect that made this project very interesting. And in terms of going very deeper into this project, I really put a lot of emphasis on the brand strategy. So that's sort of more where the research lies, is looking what's out there, what is the brand's values, the vision and mission, the personality, how the brand archetypes, which archetypes this brand is going to be like, and then using all those things to inform what the UI looks like. So you can see in that screenshot there, we have the archetypes shown there, the brand archetypes. So the core identity is the 70%, which is the creator archetype. And then the personality is the magician. That's where the wow, the pizzazz, the something different comes in. So that's sort of how I approached this branding project. And the creator and magicians were a very cool combo to work with. It's definitely in the realms of my skills and what I really enjoy doing. So, for example, to link the magician archetype to the gradients, this very whack gradient that has purple, red, and orange in it, which are all sort of primary and secondary colors, combining that into a gradient. And making, when you think WhatsApp chatbots, you think a lot tech savvy, tech heavy. But then you look at Luulo and you open it and you see there's a smiley face in the logo. So it was so cool to do this brand. And then I also created like a little avatar, a Luulo avatar, to link it to chatbots. And no, this brand was so fun. Definitely some of the most fun I've had doing branding. And yeah.
Amazing. And I think, like, you know, a lot of the things that you guys are talking about are really showing through, because both the quality of work and just the enjoyment in which you guys talk about. There are not many people who can talk about the work that they did for clients and feel proud about it. Like that is actually a sadly rare thing in the design industry. So it's kind of really great to sort of see that.
Yeah,
absolutely, especially with such big projects. And if it was one of your first projects, working together, as well as one of your first projects for Jack outside of varsity, right? It's a lot to take on as a as a newbie stepping into a full-time job and figuring all of it out all at once.
It was the ultimate test.
Yes, yeah, coming
And you guys passed.
from stepping out of university as a developer, going into a massive design project.
And doing branding. Wow.
Yeah.
Well done.
Learning
guys.
on the job.
Exactly.
But I think we're coming to the closing stage of this discussion, and it's been really cool to sort of follow through this through line narrative of Jack as a whole, but then also to kind of end off with two people who are a little bit new to the professional space, and to see you guys thriving the way that you are. I think there's a part of me that's glad that it's getting better for the people entering the industry when I see people like you guys actually making it relatively quickly in comparison to a lot of other people. So it's definitely something you guys can be proud of. And one of the things that I'd like to do to kind of end off this episode, which I've been kind of keeping as my running theme, is a little bit of a somewhat theatrical exercise, similar to how I'd been doing previously. Starting off with taking a deep breath. I want you to think back. Think back to your final year at varsity as you're about to head over to sit down at that table with all of the other developer people. All the other people who have kind of studied the same thing as you are about to enter this brand new world of unknown. And imagine you today goes and sits down with you back then. And you're able to give yourself one little piece of advice to make it through the journey from then to now. What would you say to yourself? And Claudia, I'll let you kick us off.
I think mine would be a very short and sweet thing. I'll probably say trust the process. Most of all, just don't focus so much on worrying about what you're going to get into, but rather just go along with what happens. Trust the process. See where you will end up, and don't worry so much about the semantics about it.
Amazing. Dylan?
I would say I would have told myself to enjoy the process. That's a big thing for me. Like with the dev in the university, it was a stressful environment and it sort of hindered some things. So I would have told myself just enjoy what you are doing and to pursue what you love doing. That's definitely the biggest thing I would have told myself back then, and also value the relationships you build while doing that.
Amazing. That's words that could have come from the mouth of a monk. So I love it. And I think it's also maybe a poetic place to kind of end this episode. So Dylan, Claudia, thank you very much for your time and your willingness to share your journey with us. To everybody listening, you'd have heard a little bit about where to find Jack, but if you didn't, check www.jackstudio.co.za or follow them on the Instagrams, the LinkedIns, and so on. Today we have Dylan and Claudia. You can find them both in the show notes. But otherwise, guys, thank you very much for your time. We appreciate you.
Yes, thank you, Alfie, for having us. Super fun.
And to everybody listening, thank you. Have a good day, whether it is morning or evening. Salut.
We'll see you soon.